He signed the papers without looking at her once. Nolan Pierce sat across the conference table in that glass-walled attorney's office on Michigan Avenue, his Mont Blanc pen moving with the casual efficiency of a man canceling a subscription. Not a marriage, 14 years, gone in the time it takes to initial 3 pages. Serena Ashcroft, still Ashcroft. She'd kept her maiden name through the whole marriage, something Nolan always found quietly insulting, sat on her side of the table with her hands folded in her lap. She didn't cry. She'd run out of tears somewhere around month 4 of the proceedings when Nolan's attorney first used the phrase minimal contribution to marital assets in reference to her. She watched him sign. She noticed he was wearing the cufflinks she'd given him for their 10th anniversary. She doubted he remembered that. When it was done, his attorney slid the papers across. Serena's attorney, a small, precise woman named Carol Reyes, who charged $400 an hour and had said maybe 40 words to Serena across the entire process, nudged them toward her client. Serena picked up her pen. She signed her name the same way she did everything, quietly, completely, without drama. Outside the window, 14 floors down, Chicago moved the way Chicago always moved. Indifferent, enormous, relentless. If you've ever watched someone you loved look through you like you were already gone, leave a like right now, and drop your city in the comments because I want to see how far this story travels. Subscribe and stay with me to the end, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about quiet women. Tomu. The courthouse steps were wet from an earlier rain, and Serena's single suitcase, a gray hard-shell roller she'd bought herself at a clearance sale 3 years ago, because Nolan said the old fabric one looked cheap, caught on a crack in the concrete as she pulled it behind her. She stopped, freed the wheel, kept walking. That was the entirety of her exit from 14 years of marriage. No one was waiting for her at the bottom of the steps. She'd called a car service the night before, using the last of the cash she'd kept in a personal account Nolan's attorneys hadn't found because it was small enough and old enough that they hadn't looked hard. $4,200. That was what 14 years of careful, invisible saving had produced in a hidden account, because she'd known, not recently, but for a long time, that she might need to leave fast someday with something that was only hers. The car was a black sedan, driver named Marcus, who held the door without comment and put her suitcase in the trunk without being asked. She appreciated that more than she could explain. She sat in the back seat and looked at her phone. One message from a number she didn't recognize sent 11 minutes ago. "We know it's done. We're already there." She stared at that message for a long time. Then she typed back, "Not yet. Give me an hour." The response came in under 10 seconds. "Of course, Miss Ashcroft, we'll be waiting." She put the phone face down on her knee and looked out the window at the city moving past. Nolan Pierce did not go back to his office after the signing. He went instead to the restaurant on Wabash where his girlfriend, Daria Castillo, had been waiting since 10 that morning with a bottle of champagne she'd been not quite hiding in her tote bag since she walked in. Daria was 31, which Nolan found deeply satisfying in ways he didn't examine, and she worked in commercial real estate, which meant she understood money and ambition in a language Nolan recognized. She also hated Serena with a specific, focused energy that Nolan had always found clarifying. "Done?" she said when he walked in. "Done." She poured 2 glasses before he'd even sat down. "To new beginnings." He touched his glass to hers. "To new beginnings." "She take anything?" "Personal property, some furniture she picked herself, no claim on the business holdings, no claim on the Chicago properties." He drank. "Her attorneys put up a fight about the Evanston house, but we buried them in appraisal documents." Daria smiled. It was the smile she had when a deal closed favorably. And she just accepted that. She accepted it. He set his glass down. "That's the thing about Serena. She never fought for anything. That's why I knew, even years ago, that it wouldn't work long term. You need a partner who wants to win." Daria reached across the table and put her hand over his. "Well, now you have one." What Nolan did not mention, because it didn't seem worth mentioning, was that Serena had never once asked him for anything during the divorce. Not the Evanston house, not the investment accounts, not even the car she'd driven for 6 years that was technically in his name. She'd sat through 11 months of proceedings with that same expression, present but remote, like someone listening to a translation of a conversation happening in another room, and signed what was put in front of her. It had made his attorneys nervous. People who don't fight for anything during a divorce are either defeated or they don't need to fight. His attorneys had decided she was defeated. Serena had Marcus drive her to the private terminal on the south end of O'Hare, which was not where she'd told the car service to take her. She'd given him a different address initially, a hotel in Lincoln Park, where she'd booked a room for one night while she figured out the next steps. But somewhere on the Dan Ryan, watching the skyline recede, she'd made a decision she'd been refusing to make for almost 3 years. Change of destination, she told Marcus. I'll send you the address. He didn't ask questions. She sent him the terminal code and watched his GPS reroute without comment. Good driver. When they pulled through the security gate and onto the private apron, the jet was already there. It was not a small plane. A matte black Gulfstream G700, tail number unregistered to anything publicly searchable, sat on the tarmac with its stairs already down, flanked on 3 sides by black SUVs whose windows were dark enough to be walls. There were 8 men that Serena could count standing between the SUVs and the aircraft, all of them in dark clothing, none of them moving. Not the restless shifting of men waiting, the absolute stillness of men who had been trained to be furniture until they were needed to be weapons. Marcus stopped the car. He looked in the rearview mirror. For the first time, his professional composure showed a single crack. His eyes had gone slightly wide. You want me to... I'm fine, Serena said. Thank you, Marcus. Please keep the change from the estimate. She got out. The November air hit her immediately, the kind of cold that comes off Lake Michigan and means business. One of the men near the closest SUV walked toward her. He was somewhere in his 40s, with a face that had been rearranged at some point by something harder than a fist, and he moved like someone who had learned years ago that posture is a form of communication. He stopped 2 feet away from her and put his right hand to his chest, a gesture that was almost a bow. Welcome home, Miss Ashcroft, he said. The boss is waiting. Behind her, she heard Marcus's sedan pull away. She looked at the man. Is he angry? No, ma'am. He's relieved. She picked up the handle of her gray suitcase, the clearance sale one, the cheap one, the one with $4,200 worth of invisible survival embedded in its history, and walked toward the stairs. One of the other men moved to take the bag from her. She held on to it. He stepped back. She climbed the stairs alone. The interior of the jet was not what she expected, which was exactly what she should have expected, because Lucien Vescari had never done anything the predictable way. There was no gold, no ostentatious leather, no built-in bar lined with crystal decanters performing wealth at her. The interior was dark wood and charcoal fabric and good lighting positioned the way good lighting should be, to make a space feel larger, not to show off. It looked, Serena thought, less like a private jet and more like the study of someone who read serious books and didn't feel the need to tell you about it. Lucien was sitting at the table at the rear of the aircraft, and he stood when she entered. He was 53 years old, and he looked it, not in the way that means diminished, but in the way that means the softness burned off long ago, and what's left is structural. Gray had moved significantly into the dark hair at his temples. His face had lines that hadn't been there the last time she'd seen him in person, 4 years ago, at her father's funeral in a cemetery outside Zurich, where rain fell so precisely it felt arranged. He wasn't a large man, physically. He was maybe 2 inches taller than she was. The reason people in 20 countries crossed the street when his name came up had nothing to do with his size. Serena, he said, just her name. Nothing attached to it. She sat down across from him without being asked. She put her suitcase beside her seat. She looked at him with the same directness she'd had since she was 17 years old, the quality her father had called her most dangerous feature. You could have waited, she said. I could have, Lucien agreed. He sat back down. Between them on the table was a pot of coffee, 2 cups, and a single folder that she didn't look at yet. I gave you 3 years. You gave me 3 years, And then you showed up with a Gulf Stream and 8 men. 6 men. 2 of them were the pilots. Lucien. He looked at her steadily. He was going to leave you with nothing. I know you knew that. I know you decided to let him. He paused. I gave you the space to make that choice. I'm not sure I was right to. The aircraft engines had begun their low, rising whine somewhere underneath the conversation. She hadn't felt the stairs retract, but they must have, because through the oval window, she could see they were no longer level with the terminal. I didn't ask you to come, she said. No, you didn't. He reached across and poured coffee into both cups, with the practical ease of someone who'd done it 1,000 times in 1,000 uncomfortable situations. But I made a promise to your father, and your father is dead, so the only person left to hold me to it is me. He slid her cup across. And myself, I don't negotiate with. Serena wrapped her hands around the cup. The coffee was dark and had the specific smell of something prepared carefully, not because someone wanted to impress her, but because Lucien did not believe in careless coffee. It was one of the things she'd always found quietly impressive about him. The man who controlled a criminal network spanning 4 continents had genuine opinions about coffee. What did the promise say exactly? She asked, though she knew. She needed to hear him say it. That I would protect you, Lucien said, until you chose your own destiny. He met her eyes. You spent 3 years choosing someone else's version of your life. That choice is over now, so I'm here for the next part. Outside, Chicago was falling away below them. 14 years earlier, Serena Ashcroft had walked into a graduate seminar at Northwestern with a fake name, Sarah Cole, a history she had constructed carefully and a need so specific it kept her up at night. She needed to know what it felt like to be nobody, not figuratively, not as a philosophical exercise. She genuinely did not know. She had grown up as Elias Ashcroft's daughter, which meant she had grown up knowing that the weight of her father's name preceded her into every room by roughly 30 seconds. By the time she was 16, she understood that the men who smiled at her too quickly were calculating. By the time she was 19, she understood why. Her father was not a simple man. He was not, by any measure that most people would use, a good man. He had built something from nothing in the early 1980s, when he was 22 and had just arrived in the United States from a family in Palermo, that he never discussed with more than 2 sentences and a closed expression. What he built over the next 30 years was enormous and complicated and required a certain tolerance for darkness that Elias Ashcroft had possessed in full measure. He had also, genuinely, loved his daughter. Those 2 things coexisted in him without apparent conflict, which Serena had found simultaneously moving and deeply troubling for most of her adult life. She had left at 22. Not explosively. She hadn't fought with her father, hadn't issued ultimatums or thrown the family legacy back in his face with dramatic speeches. She had simply told him, in a kitchen in the house outside Geneva where she'd grown up, that she wanted to live without the shadow, that she wanted to find out who she was when nobody knew her name. Elias had looked at her for a long time. He was 60 then, already beginning to show the signs of the illness that would kill him 6 years later. And there was something in his face, not hurt, exactly, but a specific kind of recognition that she was doing the thing he had never had the courage to do. Walking away from power before power became the only thing left. All right, he'd said. Sarah Cole. I'll have the papers made. I don't want papers. I want it to be real. Then make it real, he'd said. But Lucien goes with you, not following you, not watching you, just present. 1 phone call away. She had agreed to that. It seemed reasonable. It turned out to be the quietest form of protection she'd ever experienced, because in 14 years, Lucien Vescari had never once appeared unless she called him. He existed in her life as a constant and invisible pressure, the way good architecture makes you feel safe without ever asking you to think about why. She had become Sarah Cole. She had enrolled at Northwestern under that name, taken literature courses she loved, met people who liked her for the flat, unhistoried version of herself she presented. And in her 2nd year of the program, she had met Nolan Pierce. Nolan was finishing his MBA at Kellogg. He was 28, good-looking in a symmetrical country club way, and he had a quality she found immediately interesting. He was self-made. Genuinely. His father had been a machinist in Rockford, his mother a school administrator. Everything Nolan Pierce had was produced by Nolan Pierce, through a combination of intelligence, relentless work, and an ambition he wore so openly that it was almost refreshing. He didn't know who she was. Not Sarah Cole the persona. He didn't know Serena Ashcroft existed. He looked at her and saw a woman with a warm laugh and careful eyes and a habit of reading 2 books simultaneously that he found inexplicably charming. She looked at him and saw someone who had never had anything handed to him. For a woman whose entire life had been the opposite, it was intoxicating. They were married inside 2 years. She used the Sarah Cole identity for the license and spent the months before the wedding in a cold silence of indecision about whether to tell him the truth. She had told Lucien, during one of their twice-yearly phone calls, that she was marrying someone. There had been a pause on the line. Then, what does he do? MBA, he's starting a development company. Does he know who you are? No. Another pause, longer. Serena, I know. That's a foundation with a crack in it. I know that too. She had married him anyway because she was 26 and in love and convinced, the way you can only be convinced of something when you are 26 and in love, that what she was building was strong enough to survive a crack in the foundation. The first years were good, genuinely good. Not the retrospective performance of goodness that people construct after marriages fail, but actual good, with specific memories she could still access clearly even now. Nolan making terrible eggs on Sunday mornings and refusing to admit they were terrible. Driving through Wisconsin in October when the trees went insane with color. A hotel room in New Orleans where they'd stayed an extra 2 days because neither of them wanted to go back to regular life. The crack appeared around year 5. It didn't appear dramatically. It appeared the way structural damage usually does, and invisible until it wasn't. Nolan's development company had grown faster than he'd planned, which meant it had grown faster than his systems and his judgment could keep pace with. He needed capital. He needed connections. And slowly, without acknowledging it directly, he began to resent that his wife, who had no career, no family wealth, no obvious resources, who worked part-time at a nonprofit and seemed content with that, couldn't provide either. He didn't say it out loud for years. He didn't have to. Resentment has its own grammar, and Serena had grown up around men who were fluent in it. The woman at the gala in year 7 was named Daria Castillo. Serena knew about her before Nolan thought she did. She made the decision in the bathroom of that gala, standing in front of a mirror in a dress she'd bought on sale because Nolan managed their accounts, and she didn't want him to see an expensive charge, that she was going to give it 2 more years. Not because she was passive, not because she was afraid, but because she needed to get something in order before she left, and getting things in order took time, and time required patience, and patience was the one quality she possessed in genuinely unnatural quantities. She had spent those 2 years doing 3 things: quietly moving her small earnings into an account he couldn't see, making a single untraceable phone call to Lucien Viscari to say it's going to end, I need to know you're available, and waiting. Lucien had said, I've been available since 2010. Call me when you're ready. She had called him 4 months ago. The jet had leveled off. Through the window, the flat gray of the Midwest spread out below them in every direction, stitched with roads and crop lines and the geometry of a country that never stopped moving even when you weren't watching. He's going to lose everything, Serena said. Not a question. Lucien turned his coffee cup slowly on the table. Once. People who make certain choices tend to arrive at certain destinations. That's not an answer. No, he agreed. She looked at him directly. You leave him alone, Lucien. Whatever he's walked into, whatever is going to happen to him, it's not from you. You understand me. Something moved behind his eyes. It wasn't agreement, and it wasn't refusal. It was the expression of a man deciding how much truth to put in his next sentence. I understand you, he said. She held his gaze for another moment. She'd known Lucien Viscari since she was 11 years old, had watched him navigate 30 years of situations where the wrong word at the wrong moment ended someone's existence, and she knew, with the bone-deep certainty of someone who had spent a lifetime reading Power, that what he'd just said was not the same as I will do what you asked. She filed that away. She would come back to it. The folder, she said. He slid it across the table. She opened it. Inside were 6 pages of documents, along with a smaller envelope she recognized, cream-colored, bearing a wax seal that had been her father's, that she had not expected to see here. That was in the Zurich account, she said. He left it for when you came back. Lucien's voice was careful now. He said you'd come back eventually. He said to give it to you when you did. Serena picked up the cream envelope. Her father's handwriting was on the front. For Serena, when she is ready. Her hands were very still. Outside, at 37,000 feet, the Midwest slid underneath them toward whatever came next. She didn't open the envelope yet. She put it in the inside pocket of her jacket, against her chest, and sat back, and looked out the window at the country she'd been hiding in for 14 years. And for the first time since she'd walked down those courthouse steps with her clearance sale suitcase and the quiet finality of a woman who had already survived the worst of it, Serena Ashcroft allowed herself to consider the possibility that she was not, in fact, starting over. She was starting. Just starting. She opened the envelope at 39,000 feet, somewhere over Nebraska, when Lucienne had stepped to the front of the aircraft to take a call, and she was alone with the hum of the engines and the flat white sky outside the window. The letter inside was 3 pages, handwritten, in her father's cramped and deliberate script, the handwriting of a man who had learned English as his third language and still wrote it with the precision of someone who understood that words, set down permanently, were a form of contract. Serena, if you're reading this, you came back. I knew you would. Not because you failed, don't read it that way. Because you're mine, and the Ashcroft blood doesn't let you disappear forever. It finds its way home eventually, even when home is the last place you thought you'd return to. There are things I didn't tell you when I was alive. Some of them I couldn't. Some of them I chose not to, because you were 22 and in love with the idea of a quiet life. And I genuinely thought that maybe you could have it. That maybe my sins didn't have to follow you. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about several things, and I want to name them before you walk into what comes next, because you're going to need to know the shape of what you're carrying. She stopped reading there. Not because she couldn't continue, because Lucien was walking back down the aisle toward her, and she needed a moment before she let anyone see her face. She folded the pages, returned them to the envelope, put the envelope back inside her jacket. Anything I should know? Lucien asked, settling back into his seat across from her. Not yet, she said. Give me tonight. He looked at her with that particular stillness he had, the quality of a man who had survived long enough to understand that pushing people rarely produced the information you actually needed. All right. Where are we landing? New York, the Midtown property. It's been maintained. Your rooms are the same. He paused. I didn't touch anything. She believed him. That was one of the strange constants of Lucien Vescari. He didn't lie to her. He withheld. He deflected. He navigated around truth with a diplomat's precision, but the things he actually said to her directly were true. She'd tested it against verifiable reality enough times over the years to trust the pattern. And Nolan? She asked. Something moved across his face, too fast to read clearly. What about him? You said people who make certain choices arrive at certain destinations. She held his eyes. What destination is he arriving at? Lucien picked up his coffee cup, set it down without drinking. There are things in motion that I didn't put in motion, he said finally. Things that were already moving before you called me 4 months ago, before the divorce proceedings started. He met her gaze with the directness he reserved for information he wanted her to absorb completely. Your husband has been doing business with people who don't conduct business the way he thinks they do. The aircraft shifted slightly. A pocket of turbulence, nothing significant, but Serena felt it in her sternum the way you feel things differently at altitude. What people? She said. Daria Castillo didn't come into his life by accident, Lucien said. The silence that followed had weight. In Chicago, at the restaurant on Wabash, Nolan Pierce was on his 3rd glass of champagne and feeling, for the first time in 11 months, like a man who had solved a problem that had been dragging at him for years. Daria's hand was still over his on the table. She was talking. Something about a property in River North she'd been tracking. A development opportunity that would require the kind of capital Nolan's company could now realistically mobilize, since it wasn't carrying the dead weight of a domestic situation that produced nothing and cost everything. And he was listening, mostly, but part of him was somewhere else. Part of him was still watching Serena sign those papers. He didn't know what to do with that. He'd told himself and Daria and his attorney, and himself again, that what he felt watching Serena leave was relief. He'd assembled the case for relief carefully and lived inside it for months. She was holding him back. She had no ambition. She'd never built anything. She was a gentle and fundamentally passive person who was fine for who he'd been at 28, but couldn't keep up with who he was now. He believed this. The evidence supported it, and yet, the way she'd signed those papers, not fast, not slow, just completely. The way she'd picked up her bag afterward with the specific composure of someone who had already done their grieving somewhere private and was now simply executing the logistics of what came after. It had looked less like defeat and more like the conclusion of a calculation she'd been running for years. Nolan. He came back to the table. Daria was looking at him with an expression he'd learned to recognize. Affectionate impatience. The face she made when his attention wandered in a direction she found unproductive. "Sorry," he said. "Long morning." "She's gone," Daria said, simply, cleanly, with the finality of someone closing a door. "Let her be gone." He drank his champagne. Right. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. Marcus Reeve, the senior VP at Consolidated First, one of his 3 primary lending partners. He'd been expecting a call from Marcus, say they had a term sheet due end of week on the River North acquisition, but not at noon on a Wednesday. He answered, "Marcus, I was going to call you this afternoon." "Nolan." Marcus's voice was flat in a way Nolan had never heard before from a man who operated in permanent hospitality mode. "I need you to come in, today. I have a meeting at 3. I can do 4:30. Now, Nolan. I mean, now." The champagne in his glass caught the restaurant light and threw a small refracted arc across the tablecloth. He watched it for a moment. "I'll be there in 30 minutes, he said. He put the phone down. Daria was watching him with a different expression now. Something that, if he'd been paying a different kind of attention, he might have identified as calculation. "Everything okay?" she said. "Probably," he said. It wasn't. What? Marcus Reeve had been in commercial lending for 27 years. He had a corner office, a firm handshake, and a congenital inability to deliver bad news without first discussing sports. When Nolan arrived, and Marcus did not mention the Cubs, did not offer coffee, and had 2 men in the conference room that Nolan had never seen before, both of them in suits that cost more than anything Marcus typically encountered at Consolidated First, Nolan understood before he sat down that the problem was not a term sheet. "Sit down, Nolan," Marcus said. Nolan sat. "These gentlemen are from our Compliance and Risk Management Division," Marcus said. He didn't give their names. "We've had to conduct a review of your accounts and your lending relationship with us. This review was—" He paused, looked briefly at the 2 men. "Initiated internally, based on some patterns that were flagged to us." "What patterns?" Nolan said. One of the 2 men, older, with the kind of face that stayed neutral, the way trained faces stay neutral, opened a folder. He didn't turn it toward Nolan. He looked at his own copy. "Several of your business accounts show transactional patterns consistent with the layering phase of money laundering," the man said. "Specifically, a series of transfers totaling approximately $9.3 million across 18 months, cycling through 3 shell entities with registered addresses in Delaware and Cayman." Nolan stared at him. "I don't have shell entities," Nolan said. "2 of the entities are registered to you as sole owner," the man said. He turned the folder around now. The documents inside had Nolan's signature on them. He recognized the signature. He did not recognize having signed those specific documents. "That's not—" He stopped, picked up the top page, read it, put it down. "I never signed this." The man looked at him with the flatness of someone who had heard that sentence many times and had developed a professional response that contained no opinion of its own. We'll need to freeze your primary business accounts pending the conclusion of our internal review and notification to the appropriate regulatory bodies. Marcus Reeve was looking at his desk. Marcus, Nolan said. I'm sorry, Nolan, Marcus said. To his desk. My hands are tied. Serena's rooms at the Midtown property, a floor of a building that, to public records, belonged to a real estate holding entity with no name recognition and no scandal, were exactly as Lucian had said. Same bed, same pale gray walls, same books on the shelf she'd left when she walked out of this life at 22. She ran her finger along the spines and felt the particular grief of recognizing your own past taste. She'd been younger than she knew how to measure. She sat on the edge of the bed and took out her father's letter and read the rest of it. He told her about the ledgers. Not in those words. Elias Ashcroft had never used a direct word when an oblique one would suffice, which was a quality she had inherited and then actively tried to unlearn. But the meaning was clear. In the years before he died, her father had compiled records. Financial records, transaction records, records that documented the movement of money across criminal networks on 3 continents, with the specificity of a man who understood that information was the only currency that never devalued. He'd embedded those records in her, not in the obvious way, not a USB drive, not a physical document, not something that could be found in a search or confiscated at a border. He'd given her encrypted access codes disguised as the kind of meaningless strings of numbers and letters that appear in email signatures and phone contacts and margin notes in books. Strings she'd been carrying around for years without knowing what they were. The letter told her what they were. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner, he'd written. I thought ignorance would protect you. I was wrong. Knowledge is the only protection that doesn't depend on someone else's willingness to provide it. Everything you need to understand what you're carrying is in the account in Basel. The access string is the 4th line of the email I sent you on your birthday. In 2019, you thought it was a mistake. It wasn't. She'd deleted that email. She sat very still with that information for a moment. Then she got up and went to the desk and opened the laptop that was already there. Charged, as though someone had prepared for her arrival with specific attention to detail, and began the process of accessing her deleted email archive. She had the string in 11 minutes. She looked at it. 22 characters, random appearing, meaningless to anyone who didn't know to look. She looked at it for a long time. Then she closed the laptop and picked up her phone and called Lucian. He answered on the first ring, which meant he'd been waiting. I need to know, she said, how much of what's in the Basel account you already know about. A pause, shorter than the ones he usually deployed, which meant he'd been prepared for the question. Some of it, he said. How much is some? Serena. Lucienne. How much? Another pause, then. I knew about the ledgers. I didn't know about the access strings. Your father kept that from me. Why would he keep that from you? The silence this time was different. Not preparation, not navigation. It was the silence of a man deciding whether to say the true thing. Because, Lucienne said finally, he wasn't sure I would always be on the right side of what those ledgers revealed. She let that sit between them. Are you? She asked. I'm on your side, Lucian said. Those are not always the same thing, but in this case they are. That's not an answer. No, he said. It isn't. She ended the call subtra trot. At 9:17 that evening, Nolan Pierce sat in the living room of the Evanston house, the house his attorneys had successfully kept in the settlement, which felt now like winning a point in a game that had turned out to be about something else entirely. With a bourbon he wasn't drinking, and a phone with 4 missed calls from his attorney and 2 from a number he didn't recognize. The compliance meeting at Consolidated First had lasted 3 hours and produced nothing that made him feel better, and several things that made him feel considerably worse. He had signed documents he'd never seen before. He had authorized transfers he had no memory of authorizing. His attorney, reached by phone after the meeting, had said the words significant exposure and potentially criminal, and you need to not talk to anyone until I've seen these documents myself, in that order, with the controlled calm of someone trying not to alarm a patient before they'd reviewed all the test results. He called Daria. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. He sat with the phone in his hand and thought about the documents at Consolidated first. Thought about his signature on them. The specific signature, the one he'd spent years developing because he believed a man's signature should be distinctive. His signature on documents creating two shell companies he'd never heard of, authorizing the movement of $9.3 million he could not account for. He put the bourbon down, picked up his phone, called Daria a third time. This time it didn't ring at all. It went directly to a fast, busy signal, which was the sound, he was about to learn, of a number that had been disconnected. Lucien Vescari did not sleep that night. This was not unusual. He slept 4 hours on good nights, less on complicated ones, and had long since stopped thinking of this as a problem and started thinking of it as a feature. The hours between 2 and 5 in the morning had given him more useful thinking time than any other period of his adult life. He stood at the window of his own room in the Midtown property, 2 floors above Serena's, not because hierarchy demanded it, but because the view of the street was better, and had a conversation on a burner phone with a man named Carver Holt, who was, in any public accounting of the world, a retired federal prosecutor living outside Asheville, North Carolina. Carver Holt was not living outside Asheville, North Carolina. "She has the strings," Lucian said. "Does she know what she can unlock?" "She knows it's the ledgers. She doesn't know the scope yet." A sound on the line that was not quite a breath and not quite a word. "That's going to change fast once she pulls the Basel account." "I know." Lucien. Carver's voice was the voice of a man who had done difficult things and retained the ability to sound reasonable while discussing them. "The Solon Group cannot find out she has access before we've had a chance to position properly. If they move first, they won't," Lucian said. "How can you be—" "Because they don't know she's in New York. They think she's still in the courthouse settlement process. They think she's broke and isolated and of no immediate use to anyone." He turned from the window. "They think she's nothing. That's what I've let them believe for 3 years. I need that to last 48 more hours." "And if it doesn't?" "Then we skip the positioning," Lucien said, "and we go directly to the part where it gets ugly." He ended the call. Below his window, a black SUV turned onto the cross street and slowed, not stopped, slowed, in front of the building, then continued on. Lucian watched it go. His right hand, where it rested against the glass, was very still. It was probably nothing. Probably. Serena had the Basel account open at 2 in the morning. It had taken her 4 attempts to get the verification sequence right. Her father had built in a 24-hour lockout after 3 failed attempts, which was the kind of thing a meticulous man did, and Elias Ashcroft had been, above all things, meticulous. What she found inside was not money. There was money, yes, more of it than she was going to process tonight. But that wasn't what stopped her. What stopped her was the index, a categorized, cross-referenced, date-stamped index of financial transactions spanning 31 years, documenting the movement of criminal money through legitimate institutions across North America, Europe, and Southeast Asia, with account numbers, entity names, and this was the part that stopped her breathing for a full 3 seconds. The names of 17 individuals currently serving in senior positions in the United States federal government. She read the first page of the index carefully. Then she scrolled to the last entry. It was dated 11 days before her father died. The last name on the index was one she recognized, not from her father's world, from Nolan's. She looked at that name for a long time. Then she did something she hadn't done in 4 years. She opened her contacts, scrolled past numbers she'd had for decades but never called, and found the one labeled simply CH. She dialed. It rang twice. "I was wondering when you'd get there," said Carver Holt. The sound of his voice, expected and yet not expected, landed somewhere in her chest like a stone dropped into deep water. "You knew my father," she said. It wasn't a question. "I did." "You know about the ledgers?" "I do." "How long have you known?" 14 years, Carver said. "Since about 6 months after you became Sarah Cole and married Nolan Pierce. Your father contacted me because he needed someone inside a certain process who could watch what was developing around your husband's business interests and tell him whether it was something he needed to worry about." The room was very quiet. Outside the window, the city made its constant low sound. traffic, distance, the permanent aliveness of New York at 2 in the morning. Was it something he needed to worry about, she asked, though she already knew. Yes, Carver said. But by the time we understood the scope, your father was too sick to move on it, and you were already in the middle of it, and moving too fast would have put you directly in the path of people who would not have handled your presence there carefully. So everyone waited, she said. Everyone waited. For what? For you to leave him, Carver said simply. For you to leave him and land somewhere safe, which you have now done. She sat back in the desk chair. On the screen in front of her, her father's index glowed with the steady light of 31 years of secrets, and somewhere in it was the name of someone connected to the man she'd just divorced, and at the bottom of all of it was the question she couldn't yet see clearly enough to ask. Carver, she said. Daria Castillo. A pause. Tell me, she said. She works for the Solon Group, Carver said. Has for 6 years. Her assignment, when they placed her in Nolan's life 3 years ago, was to isolate his business from any protective network, create financial leverage over his accounts, and use his signature to clean money through his holding entities. Another pause. The isolation required removing you. The word landed cleanly. Removing. They engineered the divorce, she said. They accelerated what was already breaking, Carver said. There's a difference, but the intent was the same. Serena looked at the screen, at her father's handwriting, digitized, 31 years of a life she'd been trying to step away from since she was 22. How much danger is Nolan in right now? She said. The pause this time was the longest yet. The kind, Carver said, that ends in one of 2 ways. She closed her eyes. I need 24 hours, she said. Serena. 24 hours, Carver. Don't move anything until I've talked to Lucy Ying. N. She ended the call before he could respond. She sat in the dark room with the glowing screen and the letter from her dead father and the weight of a name at the bottom of an index that connected everyone she'd spent 14 years trying to keep separate. Then she stood up, picked up her phone, and walked to the elevator. Lucienne's floor. Now. Because the thing she'd understood reading the last line of her father's index was that this had never been about a quiet woman who married the wrong man and lost everything in a divorce. It had been about what she was carrying without knowing it. And someone, the Solon Group, Carver Holt, possibly Lucien himself, had known that all along. She stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the floor above. The doors closed on her reflection, a woman with her father's eyes, her father's patience, and she was beginning to understand her father's enemies. The elevator began to rise. Lucien answered the door before she knocked. He was still dressed, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbow, the kind of undone that meant he'd been working, not sleeping. He had a phone in one hand and a look on his face that told her he'd known she was coming before the elevator reached his floor. Carver called you, she said. Carver called me 30 seconds after you hung up on him. He stepped back from the doorway. Come in. The room was larger than hers, set up less like a bedroom and more like an operations center that happened to contain a bed. 2 laptops open on the desk, a whiteboard she didn't remember being there before, covered in names and numbers connected by lines drawn in blue marker. A half-eaten plate of food pushed to one side with the particular carelessness of a man who eats because the body requires it and not for any other reason. She walked to the whiteboard. Read it. Several of the names she recognized from her father's index. 3 of them she didn't, which was more disturbing than the one she did. One name, near the top right corner, was circled twice in red. Solon, she said. Victor Solon, Lucien said, closing the door. 61. Born in Odessa. Spent the 90s moving between Budapest, Frankfurt, and Sao Paulo, building what is now one of the 4 largest criminal financial networks in the world. He does not run guns, he does not run drugs, he runs money. Other people's money through his systems for a percentage that varies between 12 and 22 points, depending on the volume and the risk of the client. He came to stand beside her at the whiteboard. Your father spent the last 8 years of his life building a case against him. I know that now, she said. What I didn't know is that Solon knew about me. He's known about you for 6 years. 6 years. She turned and looked at Lucien directly. You knew he knew. Lucian didn't look away. Yes. And you didn't tell me. Telling you would have required telling you everything else. And you had... He stopped. Chose the next word with visible care. You had made a decision about how you wanted to live. I thought, and I still think I was not entirely wrong, that giving you the full picture while you were inside that marriage would have paralyzed you or gotten you killed. Solon doesn't move on targets who appear inconsequential. The moment you started acting like you knew what you were carrying, you became consequential. So you protected me by keeping me ignorant. I protected you by letting you appear exactly as ignorant as you needed to appear. She held his gaze for a moment that went on long enough to be uncomfortable, which she intended. That ends now, she said. Yes, he said. It does. She walked to the desk and pulled one of the chairs around so it faced the room rather than the laptops, and sat in it with the deliberateness of someone establishing terms. Tell me everything, she said. Not the version where you decide what I can handle. Everything. Lucien pulled the other chair around and sat across from her. He put his hands on his knees. He looked, for the first time since she'd seen him on that jet, like a man preparing to do something he found genuinely difficult. Your father didn't die of cancer, Lucian said. The sentence went into the room like a key into a lock. Serena did not move. What did you say? She said, quietly. The way you speak when you need to be certain you heard correctly before you react to what you heard. Elias had the cancer. It was real, but it was managed. His oncologist in Zurich had him on a protocol that was working. He had, by the last assessment before he died, 18 months to 2 years of functional life remaining. Lucien's voice was flat and even, the voice he used when the facts themselves were doing enough damage and ornamentation would be obscene. He died of a cardiac event in his sleep in December of 2020. The attending physician signed off on it as a complication of the cancer. The physician's name is in your father's index, 4th page, under the Basel account, listed as a Solon-associated asset in the Geneva Medical Network. Serena's hands were in her lap. She looked at them. They were not shaking. She noted this as a fact about herself with the remote precision of someone observing their own body from a slight distance. Victor Solon had my father killed, she said. We believe so. We cannot prove it yet. The physician died 8 months after your father, so... Car accident in Lyon. Convenient. We, she said. Who is we? Carver. 2 people at Treasury I've worked with for 15 years. Myself. He paused. Your father, before he died, was we. He built the index specifically to give us the architecture of a prosecutable case. He knew Solon was moving on him. He knew he might not survive long enough to use it. The index was his. Contingency. She breathed. In, measured, out, measured. He sent me away, she said. 22 years old. He helped me build a fake identity and disappear into an American graduate school, and the reason wasn't just about letting me live a normal life. It was both things, Lucien said. It was genuinely both things. He wanted you free. He also needed you out of Solon's operational awareness while he built the case. A daughter inside the empire is a leverage point. A daughter who doesn't exist is a protected asset. I was an asset, she said. You were his daughter first. Lucien said it with a certainty that surprised her. I watched him make that decision. I was in the room. He cried, Serena. Not during, but after, when you'd gone and he was alone with me and a bottle of wine he didn't drink. He cried because he knew he was sending you away for reasons he couldn't tell you, and he didn't know if he'd live long enough to explain. His jaw tightened briefly. He didn't live long enough to explain. The city outside was doing what it always did at 3 a.m, quieter than other hours, but never actually quiet, a frequency below silence that was the specific sound of 8 million people breathing in their sleep. The index, she said. Why does it have Nolan's connection to Solon at the bottom? The last entry, 11 days before he died. Lucian was quiet for a moment. Because your father figured it out 11 days before he died. He realized that Daria Castillo's positioning inside your marriage wasn't coincidental. He traced her back through 3 cutout entities to a Solon account in Malta. He stopped. He called me the night he made the connection. He was another stop, this one longer. He was not calm. He thought it was his fault. Yes. Was it? Lucian looked at her steadily. He introduced Nolan to a property developer named Greg Fassett in 2013 at a dinner in New York because Nolan was growing his company and Greg had connections your father thought would be useful. Greg Fassett has been a Solon-adjacent operator since 2009. Your father didn't know that when he made the introduction. But Solon did. Solon had been watching your father for years. When Elias's daughter, unknown identity, living quietly in Chicago, married a man who was being cultivated as a future Solon money channel through Fassett, Solon saw an opportunity. He let it develop. Waited to see if you'd surface as a threat. When you didn't, when you just kept living your quiet life, he decided you were either ignorant or irrelevant. For 6 years, he let it go. What changed 6 years ago? She said. Your father got sick, Lucian said, and sick men get urgent. Elias started moving on the index faster, pulling together documentation, reaching out to Carver. Solon's people picked up the increased activity and started looking harder at every connection your father had. He paused, including the daughter who didn't officially exist. They found me. They found the shape of you. They knew Elias had a daughter living under another name in the United States. They couldn't confirm your identity without getting closer, so they got closer through Nolan. He held her gaze. Daria was placed specifically to get closer to you through him. Something cold moved through her chest. She wasn't after Nolan's money channels. That came later. It was useful, so they used it. But the original assignment was me, Serena said, was you. She stood up. Not from agitation. She was not an agitated person by nature, and the events of the last 24 hours had not changed that. She stood because sitting suddenly felt like the wrong relationship to the information she'd just received, and she needed to be vertical while she processed the next part of it. They engineered my divorce, she said. Not to isolate Nolan for the money scheme, to isolate me, to make you visible. A woman who loses her marriage, loses her financial stability, has no family to speak of, that's a woman who has to start moving. And when people start moving, you can see where they go. Lucien's voice hadn't changed pitch or speed. He was watching her carefully. If you'd stayed in that marriage, stayed invisible, they would have kept waiting. The divorce, they needed you to surface. They thought I'd run to you. They counted on it. She turned and looked at him, and you let it happen. The pause was very short. I couldn't stop it without exposing that I knew you were under surveillance, which would have told Solon that his operation had been penetrated, which would have cost us the 4 years of inside work Carver's people have been doing. He met her eyes without flinching. I made a calculation. You made a calculation about my life? Yes. Using me as bait. Using the situation that already existed, Lucian said. You were already in the marriage. It was already failing. I didn't manufacture that. I allowed the natural conclusion to serve a dual purpose. The words were reasonable. The logic was sound. She understood both because she had grown up in rooms where men made these calculations, and she had learned to follow the arithmetic even when it made her want to put her hand through glass. She did not put her hand through anything. Where does Solon think I am right now? She said. He knows you're in New York. He doesn't know this building. How long before he finds it? At current rate, 36 hours. Maybe 48 if we're lucky and his surveillance team is having a bad week. And the train? She said. Carver mentioned a train. Lucian's expression shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible. That was his exit strategy, not yours. We were planning to move you and the index access out of New York on the overnight Amtrak to Chicago as a decoy route while actually flying you from Teterboro. Solon's people would follow the train. Would follow the train, she said, catching the tense. Past tense. That plan has a problem, Lucian said. What problem? He picked up one of the phones from the desk. turned it to show her the screen. A photograph. Security camera footage, timestamp from 40 minutes ago, taken at a location she recognized. The lobby of the building 2 blocks east that shared a service entrance with this one. 3 men in the frame, one of them with his face partially turned, but enough visible to make identification possible for someone who knew what they were looking for. "They're already here," she said. "They're 2 blocks east, which means someone gave them the neighborhood, not the specific building, but the neighborhood." He put the phone down. "We have a leak." The word landed differently than all the other words had tonight, because a leak meant someone inside, and inside was Carver, or Lucien's 2 treasury contacts, or Lucien himself, and the arithmetic of that had exactly one uncomfortable implication. "Carver," she said. "I don't know." "You have a suspicion." Lucien looked at the whiteboard, at the name circled in red. "Carver Holt has been running a parallel track to mine for 14 years. Our goals have aligned. That doesn't mean our methods have, or our endpoints." He turned back to her. "He wants the index to produce prosecutions. Federal prosecutions, landmark case, a public accounting of Solon's network that goes through U.S. courts and produces convictions and changes laws." He paused. "That requires a living Serena Ashcroft, intact, to testify and authenticate the documents. He would not compromise your location to Solon." "But," she said, because there was a but in his posture. "But Carver also has handlers, the people at Treasury he reports to, and one of those people is a name in your father's index." He looked at her steadily. "Page 4, left column. The name I haven't said out loud in this room yet, because I didn't know how to get there." She crossed to the desk, pulled up the Basil account on the laptop, navigated to page 4. Left column. She read the name. Congressman. Ranking member of the House Financial Services Committee. A man she had seen once at a fundraiser in Washington that Nolan had dragged her to 3 years ago, where he'd pressed her hand between both of his and said, "Nolan tells me so much about you, with the particular warmth of a man performing warmth at a professional level. Nolan tells me so much about you." She had not thought about that moment since it happened. She thought about it now. "He knew who I was," she said, "at that fundraiser. He already knew." "Yes." He was confirming an identification. "Yes." She closed the laptop. "Carver reports to him. Among others, yes. Which means every move Carver has made in this investigation has been potentially visible to a Solon-connected congressional asset." Lucien's voice was completely level. "Yes, I've known this for 4 months. I've been trying to work around it without Carver knowing I know." The magnitude of the operational problem settled onto the room with the specific weight of something that cannot be unknown. "So Carver isn't the leak," she said. "He's the leak's conduit. He's been compromised without knowing it." "Possibly. Or he's known about the compromise for years and has been managing what information flows through it strategically." Lucien looked at her with the flat honesty she'd always been able to count on from him in the worst moments. "I cannot tell you which one it is, Serena. I've been trying to determine that for 4 months, and I don't have a definitive answer." She walked to the window. The street below was empty of the black SUV that had slowed earlier, which meant nothing, because empty streets don't mean absent threats. They mean threats that have moved to better positions. "I need to call Nolan," she said. The silence behind her was specific. She turned around. Lucien's face had the expression of a man who had prepared for several possible next sentences and had not prepared for that one. "Serena, he's in danger, real danger, not legal danger. The kind that ends in one of 2 ways is what Carver said. Solon can't leave him functional. He's a money channel with Solon's fingerprints on his accounts and a federal compliance review in progress. He's a liability." She held Lucien's gaze. "They'll clean him up." "I know that." "Then you know I have to warn him." "Warning him puts him in motion. Solon's people are watching him. If he runs or does something visible, they'll accelerate. And if I don't warn him, he sits in his house in Evanston not knowing what's coming, and they take their time." She shook her head. "I'm not leaving him to that. Whatever he did, whatever he is, I'm not leaving a man to that." Lucien looked at her for a long moment. The expression on his face was not disagreement. It was something older and harder to name, the look of a man watching someone confirm what he'd always known about their character, and not being certain whether to admire it or mourn it. If you call him, Lucien said, and his phone is monitored, which it is, they know you're reaching out. That tells them you've surfaced fully and you know enough to be worth accelerating against. I know that, she said. That changes your timeline from 48 hours to maybe 12. I know that too. He looked at her for another beat. Then, use the burner on the left side of the desk. It's clean. 3 calls maximum before it's burned. She crossed to the desk, picked up the phone. Nolan's cell number was one of approximately 11 phone numbers she had memorized in her adult life, a habit from her father who had believed that information stored only in devices was information you could be separated from. She dialed. It rang 5 times. She was preparing herself for voicemail when the line clicked. Who is this? Nolan's voice was raw-edged, the voice of a man who had not slept and was past the point where he was trying to sound like he had. It's me, she said. A silence. Then, very quiet. Serena. Yes. It's... She heard him move, a chair or a shift on a couch. It's 3 a.m. I know what time it is, Nolan. Another silence. When he spoke again, the rawness had sharpened into something more specific, and she realized with a start that what she was hearing was fear. Not the performance of fear, but the actual thing, the kind that lives in the chest and changes the quality of a man's voice even when he's trying to control it. Something is happening to my company, he said. My accounts are frozen. I can't reach Daria. My attorney called at midnight and used the word indictment, and He stopped. She heard his breathing, unsteady, too fast. I don't understand what's happening. I know you don't, she said. Nolan, listen to me carefully. You need to leave the Evanston house tonight. Right now. Tonight. Take nothing you can't carry in a backpack and go to your attorney's home address. Not office, home. And don't use your own car and don't use a car service you've used before. Pay cash for a cab if you have cash. A beat of silence. What? The people who set up your accounts did not do it to use you, she said. They did it to leave you behind. Do you understand what I'm telling you? You are the evidence they intend to abandon, and abandoned evidence doesn't get to testify. She heard him breathing. Who are you? He said. Not a strange question. The right question. The question of a man who was reassessing 14 years of what he thought he knew about a woman. Someone who knew the shape of the people around you before you did, she said. And who should have told you years ago and didn't, and I'm sorry for that. But right now, the only thing that matters is that you move. Serena. His voice had gone very still. What is your name? Your actual name? She looked across the room at Lucian, who was watching her with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who had stopped trying to control the situation and was now simply witnessing it. Serena Ashcroft, she said. That part was always true. She heard him absorb that. The Ashcroft family, he said. Slow, like he was reading a headline in a language he mostly understood. Yes. He stopped. The breath he took was audible. The crest on the plane at O'Hare today, that was, yes. I thought it was a coincidence. I thought, he made a sound that was not quite a laugh. I thought some other rich person happened to be at that terminal. Nolan, her voice was sharp now, not cruel, but the sharpness of someone cutting through to the essential. You can be stunned later. Right now you need to get out of that house. Will you do that? A pause. Yes, he said. Good. Serena. Don't call me again on any of your own devices, she said. I'll find you when it's time. And then, because it was true, and because she thought he might need to hear something true from her after a very long time of other things, I'm not leaving you to it, but you have to move. She ended the call. She set the burner down on the desk with great care, the care of someone managing a physical impulse that has nowhere constructive to go. Behind her, from across the room, Lucien said, He'll move. Yes, she said. He's scared enough. Fear motivates. Among other things. She turned from the desk. Something had shifted in her. Not visible, not dramatic, but structural. The way a building shifts when load-bearing elements change. She had spent 14 years being still, waiting. Patience as a form of survival. She recognized now, with a clarity that had the quality of cold water, that stillness was no longer an option. We need to change the plan. The train. The train, the timeline, the exit route, everything. She crossed to the whiteboard. If the building is blown and my call to Nolan just started the clock, we have until dawn before Solon's people feel confident enough to move from surveillance to action. She picked up the blue marker. So, tell me what resources you have in this building right now, not what you can get by tomorrow. Lucien looked at her with the whiteboard marker in her hand and the specific expression of a man adjusting his understanding of someone he thought he already understood completely. He told her. She began to write. Outside the window, the sky over New York was still fully dark, but 3 hours east over the Atlantic, somewhere below the horizon, the first gray suggestion of morning was beginning to build. Slow, indifferent, and entirely without mercy for anyone who wasn't ready for it. They had 4 hours. Lucien laid it out on the whiteboard in the flat, clinical language of a man who had planned extractions before and knew that sentiment at the planning stage was a form of self-destruction. 4 hours until the surveillance team outside would be reinforced at shift change. He knew their rotation schedule because one of his people had been watching the watchers since midnight. After reinforcement, the calculus of moving Serena out of the building changed from difficult to nearly impossible. 4 hours. 1 exit. 3 usable resources inside the building. The resources were a man named Declan Walsh on the building's 3rd floor, former British Special Forces, who currently served as Lucien's head of close protection operations and had arrived in New York 8 hours ago on a commercial flight from London because Lucien had not waited for Serena to decide she needed protecting. A secure communications array in the basement server room that was not connected to any external network and could not be listened to from outside. And the building's service tunnel, a relic of 1960s construction that connected to the parking structure of a hotel 2 blocks north, a detail that existed on no currently accessible city infrastructure map because the renovation permits that should have disclosed it had been misfiled in 2003 and never corrected. Serena stood at the whiteboard and looked at these 3 facts and thought about them the way her father had taught her to think about limited resources, which was, not what do you have, but what can each thing become? Declan, she said, how many people can he move through that tunnel safely? 2, 3 if one of them is small. Lucien paused. You and him. That's the tunnel option. What about you? I'm not going through the tunnel. She turned from the whiteboard. Explain that. Someone needs to stay visible in this building until you're clear. He said it with the matter-of-factness of a man discussing a scheduling preference. If the surveillance team picks up 0 movement before dawn, they get nervous and they accelerate. I need to be here producing the appearance of normal operational activity. Lights on, phone traffic, people moving in the lobby, long enough for you to reach Teterboro. And then Declan comes back for me through a different exit that will have cleared by the time you're in the air. She looked at him. That's not a plan, Lucien. That's a delay tactic with optimistic assumptions about the second act. Most good plans are. They'll take you. They'll try. He met her eyes with a steadiness that was not bravado. She knew what bravado looked like on men, and this was not it. This was the specific composure of someone who had run the probabilities and decided to proceed anyway. I've been in worse positions. She believed him. That was the terrible thing about Lucien Vescari. She always believed him, even when she didn't want to. The communications array, she said. I need 20 minutes on it before I go. For what? Carver, she said. I need to have a conversation with Carver Holt that I control the conditions of. Encrypted line, no possibility of his handlers intercepting it in real time. She paused. And I need to do it without telling him where I'm calling from. Lucien studied her. What are you going to say to him? I'm going to tell him about the congressman, she said, and then I'm going to watch, through his reaction, through his voice, whether he already knows. And if he does, then I know which version of Carver Holt we're dealing with, she said, and I plan accordingly. Lucian was quiet for a moment. That's a significant gamble to run at 3:40 in the morning under a 4-hour clock. Yes, she agreed, but I'm not walking out of this country without knowing whether the man who's been running the legal architecture of this case for 4 years is compromised or complicit. She held his gaze. Are you going to argue with me about it? A beat. No, he said. She was already moving toward the door. Nietzsche. The basement communications room smelled like recycled air and old cable, the specific, slightly metallic smell of a space that had been sealed and filtered for years without ever really breathing. Declan Walsh stood outside the door while Serena sat inside with a headset and an encrypted line and the particular solitude of a person preparing to have a conversation they cannot take back. Declan was a compact man in his late 40s with red-brown hair going gray and the quality of absolute stillness that very physical people sometimes develop. The stillness of someone who knows exactly how quickly they can move when stillness ends. He'd said 4 words to her since she'd come downstairs. Good to meet you. She'd said the same back. They understood each other immediately in the way that certain people do when they've been shaped by similar pressures, even by completely different lives. She dialed Carver Holt. He answered in 2 rings, even at 3:45 in the morning, which told her he hadn't been sleeping either, and that was itself a data point. You've changed the timeline, he said instead of hello. I called Nolan, she said. A pause. I know. The monitoring team flagged an outbound call from a clean number to his cell 40 minutes ago. They're working on tracing the originating device. His voice was level, but underneath the level there was something taut, like wire pulled one turn past comfortable. That was a significant risk, Serena. I know what it was. She kept her voice flat, factual. I need to ask you something directly. I need you to answer me directly. This is not the time for management. Ask. Congressman Dale Whitmore, she said. 4th page, left column, basal account index. What do you know about him? The silence was 3 seconds long. She counted. Where did you see that name? Carver said. 3 seconds was too long. She'd asked him a knowledge question, and his first response was a question about her source, which meant the name was not a surprise to him, which meant he'd been sitting on it, which meant the question was now about how long and why. In my father's index, she said. Where it's been since 11 days before he died. Answer the question, Carver. Another pause, shorter. I've known about Whitmore's connection to the Solon network for approximately 2 years. 2 years, she said, and you kept reporting to him. I kept reporting to his committee through normal channels while running a parallel track to document his connection. You cannot simply stop reporting to a congressional oversight structure because you suspect a committee member. You need documentation sufficient to... Carver. Her voice came out sharper than she'd planned. She let it. He's been your handler for 4 years. Every operational decision you've made on this case, the timing, the resources, the approach to the Basel account, the decision to wait for me to surface, he's had visibility on all of it. Not all of it. I compartmentalized. Solon's people are in my neighborhood right now, she said. Tonight. They're 2 blocks east and they got there fast, which means someone gave them a radius, which means someone who knew approximately where I was gave them enough to work with. She paused. Let that land. Did you tell Whitmore I was in New York? The silence this time was different, not the silence of calculation. The silence of a man experiencing something in real time that he had not experienced before, or had experienced once long ago, and had been hoping he would not have to experience again. I told him the overall relocation operation was in progress, Carver said. I didn't give him a specific location. I didn't give him New York. But you gave him enough that if he fed it to the right person, they could narrow the search. Serena, He stopped. She heard him breathe. Yes. I gave him enough for that. All right, she said. Not I forgive you, not it's fine. Just, all right. The acknowledgement of a fact that now had to be worked with rather than mourned. Then here's what's going to happen. You are going to stop communicating with Whitmore entirely, starting right now. No reports, no updates. Nothing. If he contacts you, you tell him the operation is in a sensitive phase and communication is being restricted by security protocol. He'll know something's wrong. He already knows something's wrong. The question is what he does about it, and I need him uncertain for the next 18 hours. She paused. Can you give me that? A beat. Yes. There's something else, she said. Tell me. I'm leaving the country, she said. Not permanently, but I'm moving the access to the Basel account out of reach of any U.S. jurisdiction for the duration of the next phase, which means if Whitmore tries to get a federal warrant to compel disclosure of the index contents, there's nothing to compel domestically. She paused. Your prosecution case is going to need to be built around the documentation you can access through channels I'll authorize from outside. It's going to take longer. It's going to be harder. But it's also going to be impossible for Whitmore to bury, because by the time I'm done, there won't be a version of it that's controlled by any single domestic actor. Carver was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had changed. Not softer, but somehow more textured, like the professional surface had shifted slightly and what was underneath was older and not without damage. You sound like your father. I'll take that, she said. One more thing. Nolan Pierce. Whatever case gets built, Daria Castillo's money laundering scheme, the shell entities, the Solon accounts tied to his company. I want the distinction made clearly between the transactions he authorized knowingly and the ones that were done under his signature without his knowledge. He's not clean, but he's not what they made him look like. That's a complicated ask in a criminal investigation. You're a complicated man in a complicated situation, she said. Figure it out. She pulled the headset off, stood up, walked to the door, and opened it. Declan was exactly where she'd left him, which was the only place he'd ever intended to be. Ready? She said. 5 minutes, he said. They were in the service tunnel, Serena with a backpack containing her father's letter, the cream envelope, and a single change of clothes she'd pulled from her old room, and Declan moving ahead of her with a flashlight and the economical silence of someone who had done worse things in darker places, when the first sound came from above. Not an alarm, not a shout, a single percussive sound, contained, the kind of sound that thick walls and closed doors and 17 floors of distance transform into something almost abstract. Declan stopped. She stopped. He turned off the flashlight. In the darkness, his voice was a breath. Stay here. Don't move. Don't make light. He moved back past her toward the tunnel entrance. She stood in the dark with the tunnel wall against her left shoulder and her right hand flat against the opposite wall and counted her own heartbeats, which was a technique her father had taught her at 12 years old when he'd first begun to understand what kind of world she'd been born into and what skills that world would eventually require. 34 heartbeats. Then Declan's flashlight reappeared, moving fast. They breached the lobby, he said when he reached her. Lucien's people are holding them on the first floor. We have maybe 6 minutes before they start sweeping service access. He looked at her with the specific assessment of a man rapidly repricing risk. Move. Now. They moved. The tunnel was 80 meters long, low-ceilinged, and smelled of concrete and rust and the underground water that perpetually threatened the foundations of old Manhattan construction. Serena's clearance sale suitcase was back in her room. She'd left it deliberately, a small act of letting the past stay where it was. The backpack rode high between her shoulder blades, and she matched Declan's pace without falling behind, because this was not the moment to learn that she'd been living too quietly for too long, and she refused to learn it. They came up through a maintenance door into the hotel parking structure's lowest level. Fluorescent lights, the smell of exhaust and damp concrete. 3 cars at this hour, none of them occupied. Declan had a phone out, talking quietly. She caught fragments, level B1, 2 minutes, clean exit through the delivery bay. He ended the call. Car is coming. When it stops, you get in the back, you stay down until I tell you otherwise. Understood. The car, a gray sedan, ordinary to the point of deliberate, came down the ramp from the street level with its lights dimmed and stopped 6 feet from them with the engine still running. The driver was a woman Serena hadn't met, somewhere in her 30s, with cropped hair and the contained focus of someone doing a job they were very good at. Serena got in. Declan got in the front. The car was moving before either door had fully closed. She lay across the back seat with the backpack under her head and the ceiling of the sedan 2 feet from her face, and she did not think about Lucian, who was in the building they'd just left with Solon's people in the lobby, and 6 minutes of buffer that might already be less than 6 minutes. She thought about what she had to do at Teterboro. She thought about the flight path she'd already mapped in her head while standing at the whiteboard. New York to Reykjavik. Reykjavik to Zurich. Zurich because that was where the physical archive was. Her father's original documents, the non-digital records, the proof that could survive any server compromise or account lockout or jurisdictional seizure. Zurich because that was where the attorney's office was that held her father's actual estate documents, the ones that gave her standing to access things that couldn't be accessed any other way. And Zurich because it was where she had once sat in a kitchen with her father and told him she wanted to find out who she was without his name, and he had looked at her for a long time and then said, "All right," and she had not understood until tonight what that word had cost him. She was going back to cost herself something too. The car emerged onto a street moving north. The city outside the windows looked the way it always looked at 4 in the morning. Stripped of its performance, just the structure of itself, buildings and light, and the people who belonged to the hours when no one was watching. Declan's phone buzzed. He looked at it. His hand tightened very slightly on the device. Not much, the most controlled possible version of a physical response, but she saw it from the back seat. "What?" she said. He turned to look at her over his shoulder. His face told her before his words did. "They have Lucian," he said. The jet at Teterboro was prepped and waiting, which meant Lucian had set this in motion before she'd even come upstairs to find him, which meant he had known from the moment she stepped onto his jet in Chicago that tonight was the destination, which was either the most thorough professional protection she'd ever experienced or the most controlled version of being managed she'd ever failed to detect, and she didn't have time right now to determine which. She told the pilot to hold. She sat in the same rear seat where she'd sat across from Lucian 8 hours ago, with the engines whining at idle and Declan standing at the foot of the stairs conducting a rapid conversation into his phone that she could not fully hear, and she thought about the arithmetic. Lucian in Solon's hands was not leverage against her. It was not something Solon would use to slow her down or extract the index access. He would know she wouldn't trade it, and she wouldn't. Lucian would know that too. He would have planned for that. What Lucian in Solon's hands actually was a clock. Solon would use the time to learn what Lucian knew about her current position and her next move. Lucian would not tell him, and Lucian was a man who had been in rooms where information was extracted by people who were serious about extraction. He would hold longer than most, but not indefinitely. No one held indefinitely. That was the truth that professional optimists refused to say out loud, and professionals didn't have the luxury of refusing. She had maybe 8 hours before Lucian told them something, even something small, even something he chose to give them to buy more time. 8 hours before the shape of her next move became known, Declan came up the stairs. He ducked through the aircraft door and pulled it closed behind him with the practiced movement of someone familiar with small aircraft and the need to be definitive about sealed spaces. He sat down across from her. His face was doing the thing faces do when the information they're carrying is bad, and the person carrying it has decided to deliver it cleanly rather than soften it. "Solon has him at a location in Jersey," Declan said. "The team tracked the vehicle east on 78 after they cleared the building. Safe house in Elizabeth near the port." "How many people at the location?" "Current estimate, 6 to 8. "How good are they?" "Good." No hesitation. "Solon doesn't hire civilians for containment operations." She looked at the window, the pre-dawn dark of the Teterboro apron, fuel trucks, a single other aircraft taxiing, the ordinary machinery of a private terminal at 4 in the morning. "Can you get him out?" she said. Declan's face went through something. "With what I have available right now, 2 people in addition to myself, going into a hardened location against 6 to 8 trained operators and pulling someone out clean." He stopped, started again. "It's not a favorable ratio." "Can you get him out?" she said again. He looked at her with the directness of a man who had been in enough situations to know the difference between impossible and very bad odds. "If I had 4 more people and 6 hours to position." "You have 3 hours and I can get you 2 more people." She picked up the burner phone, sir, her second call, the second of three before it was burned. She dialed a number she had found in the Basel Account Communications Archive 2 hours ago, a number that existed in her father's records as one of 6 independent contractors he maintained relationships with across Europe and North America for situations that required what he had delicately called accelerated resolution. A man answered. She didn't know his face. She knew his record. "This is Serena Ashcroft," she said. "I'm calling on my father's account." A brief silence. Then, in lightly accented English, "I heard Elias passed. I'm sorry." "Thank you. I need 2 people at Teterboro within 90 minutes. I need them equipped for a contained extraction at a port-adjacent location in New Jersey. Payment through the Basel account. I'll authorize on confirmation of arrival." A pause. Not hesitation, evaluation. 90 minutes is tight. "I know, can you do it?" "Give me 70 minutes, the man said. She ended the call. Declan was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not surprise exactly, but the recalibration of a man who had formed one assessment of a person and was now forming a different one. "You've done this before," he said. "No," she said, "but I watched someone do it for 30 years. She put the phone down. "Brief your people. When the 2 additional operators arrive, you have 40 minutes to position. I need Lucien out of that location before 5:30. "And you?" "I'll be on this jet," she said, holding. "Serena—" "He didn't leave me in that building," she said. "I'm not leaving this tarmac." Declan looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood, straightened his jacket with the small, precise movement of a man preparing to do something that would require every functioning part of him, and went back down the stairs without another word. She sat alone in the aircraft. She took her father's letter out of her backpack and held it without reading it. Outside, the sky over New Jersey had begun the very first suggestion of change. Not light yet, not even the gray that precedes light, but a quality in the darkness that was different from the darkness of 2 hours ago. The specific darkness of something that is about to be over. Her phone buzzed. The burner, not her own. A number she didn't recognize. Different from the contacts she'd used tonight. Different from Carver. Different from Nolan. She answered. "Miss Ashcroft," said a voice she had never heard before. Male, measured, with the faint European flatness of someone who had spent decades speaking English as a professional language. "My name is Victor Solan." Her hand did not tighten on the phone. She noted this. "I know who you are," she said. "Then you know I'm not calling to threaten you. Threats are for people who don't have leverage." A brief pause. "I have Mr. Vescari. He's unhurt, which is a choice I made deliberately to signal that this conversation can go a certain way." Another pause. "I want the Basel access strings. In exchange, I release Lucien Vescari and I stand down my operation against you and against Mr. Pierce entirely. You take the access strings, which are your father's legacy and not mine to own, and we go our separate ways." He said it cleanly, without theater, the offer of a man who believed it was a reasonable transaction. She looked at the window, at the dark tarmac and the single light of a fuel truck moving in the distance. "And the index," she said. "The ledgers." "The ledgers stay with you," he said. "I'm not asking for the ledgers." Which meant, she understood immediately, that the ledgers without the access strings were inert. He'd had his people evaluate the architecture of her father's system and determine that the physical records were unverifiable without the cryptographic access chain that the strings provided. He didn't need to destroy the evidence. He just needed the key. "You had my father killed," she said. A silence. "That's a serious accusation." "It's not an accusation, it's a fact." Page 4 of the index, the physician in Geneva, the cardiac event. She kept her voice level. "I'm not calling it an accusation because accusations require proof you can deny. This is something I know." The silence this time was longer. "Your father," Solon said finally, "was building a case that would have destroyed institutions that support the financial stability of several governments. Some of those governments asked me directly to ensure the case did not conclude. I operated as an agent of interest larger than my own." He paused. "I'm not asking you to forgive it. I'm asking you to be practical." "Those interests," she said, "was Congressman Whitmore one of them?" A beat. Whitmore is a small man with a large title. He's not relevant to this conversation. He's relevant to every conversation I have from this point forward, she said, because your network runs through him, and his committee controls the oversight apparatus that would shut down a prosecution of your organization. And the reason my father spent 8 years building a case that couldn't be buried by a single congressional subcommittee is that he knew that the conventional path was compromised. Miss Ashcroft, I'm not going to give you the strings, she said. The quality of the silence changed. Then Vescari is going to be removed from your location in Elizabeth, New Jersey, by a team that will arrive in approximately 47 minutes, she said. So you should factor that into whatever you say next. A pause that was very short and very dense. You're bluffing, he said. My father spent 30 years in your world, she said. You know what that means about how his daughter was raised. The silence that followed was the longest of the conversation. Then Victor Solon, who had built an empire on the calculation of other people's breaking points, said something she had not anticipated. You're exactly what he said you were, Solon said. Quiet, and not without something that might have been, in a different life, a form of respect. He told me years ago, before any of this, he told me, my daughter will not break. I thought he was a father speaking. I should have listened more carefully. The line went dead. She lowered the phone. Outside the aircraft window on the dark tarmac of Teterboro at 4:41 in the morning, 2 vehicles had just pulled up and 4 people were getting out, moving with the specific efficiency of people who had been briefed in transit and were not wasting time on arrival. Declan was already walking toward them. She sat in the seat where her father's contact across an ocean had once told her she was exactly what Elias Ashcroft had said she was, and she held that sentence in her chest like the thing it actually was. Not comfort, not victory, not resolution. Just the specific weight of being known by someone who is gone, and carrying that forward into what comes next, and not putting it down because there is no longer anywhere safe to set it. The engines idled beneath her. The team moved across the tarmac into the dark. Declan brought Lucien in at 5:47 in the morning. She heard them before she saw them. Boots on the metal stairs, 2 sets, the specific uneven rhythm of one person supporting another's weight without making a production of it. Then the aircraft door opened and Declan came through first, and Lucien came through behind him, and Serena sat very still in her rear seat and looked at the man who had promised her father he would protect her until she chose her own destiny and saw what that promise had cost him overnight. He was walking under his own power, which was the first thing. The second thing was that his face had been worked on. Not extensively, not the kind of damage that spoke of extended time and systematic intent, but enough. A cut above his left eyebrow, closed but not clean. The left side of his jaw swollen in the specific way that means a hard impact on bone. His shirt was missing 2 buttons, and the collar was wrong, pulled to one side in a way that spoke of hands grabbing it. He sat down in the seat across from her without being guided to it. Looked at her. You held the jet, he said. I held the jet, she said. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not gratitude. Gratitude would have been too simple for what was in his face. It was something more complicated, the expression of a man recalibrating something he thought he had already calculated correctly. Solon called me, she said. Lucien's eyes sharpened. When? 4:41. He wanted the access strings. Lucien for the strings, walk away clean. And? I told him no. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the engines had changed pitch. The pilot responding to some signal she hadn't given consciously, or perhaps Declan had communicated it from the stairs. The aircraft was preparing to move. He let you refuse, Lucien said. He didn't have a choice. Your extraction was already in motion. She paused. He told me my father said I wouldn't break. He seemed to feel he'd underestimated that assessment. Lucien reached up and touched the cut above his eyebrow with 2 fingers. Not examining it, just acknowledging it the way you acknowledge a thing that is true and unpleasant and finished. Victor Solon has not underestimated many people, he said, in my experience. He underestimated Elias Ashcroft's daughter, she said. Yes. Something moved in Lucien's face, not a smile. Too tired for a smile, too much weight in the room for a smile, but something adjacent to one. He did. The jet began to move. Outside. They were over the Atlantic, the eastern seaboard behind them, and the gray expanse of open ocean ahead, when Lucian told her the rest of what he knew. Not because she asked. She had asked everything she could think to ask in the building in Midtown, in the basement communications room, at the whiteboard at 3 in the morning. He told her because they were in the air, and the immediate crisis had passed its peak, and the particular silence of a man who has been carrying something too long had reached its limit. He told her that he had been present the night her father died. Not in the house in Geneva, not in the bedroom. He had been in Zurich, 40 minutes away, when the call came from the household staff, and he had driven there in the dark and arrived before the emergency services, and he had sat with Elias Ashcroft's body in the room where it had happened for 11 minutes before anyone else came. And in those 11 minutes, he had removed 2 things: a notebook from the bedside table and a phone that was not Elias's personal phone, but a secondary device, the kind that serious men keep for serious communications that cannot be associated with their primary number. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said. Flat. Not accusation. She was past accusation. Just the genuine inquiry of someone who needed to understand the architecture of the decisions made on her behalf. "Because the notebook contained your name," Lucian said. "Your real name, your Sarah Cole identity, the Chicago address, and a set of notes that made it clear your father had been in contact with someone inside Solon's network who was feeding him information. If that notebook had been found in a police inventory of the scene, your identity would have been compromised within 48 hours. He looked at his hands. "I took it to protect you. I kept it because everything in it was either operational or private, and I didn't know yet which parts were safe to surface." "And the secondary phone?" "The secondary phone had 3 recent calls to a number I didn't recognize at the time," Lucian said. "It took me 4 months to trace it. When I did—" He stopped, looked up at her. "It was Carver Holt's personal cell." She absorbed this. "My father and Carver were in direct contact," she said, "for at least the last 6 months of Elias's life, possibly longer." Lucian's voice was careful in the way it was careful when he was delivering information he'd had time to process, and she hadn't. "Carver didn't tell me this. In 4 years of working this case together, he never told me that Elias had contacted him directly. He let me believe he'd come to this through his own investigative work." "What does that mean?" she said. "It means Carver Holt knew your father personally. It means your father trusted him enough to call him directly, which is not a trust Elias extended easily or without reason. And it means—" He paused. "It means the question of whether Carver is compromised or strategic becomes more complicated. A man your father trusted and contacted directly, who then spent 4 years running a case built on your father's index, who allowed himself to report to a compromised congressional handler. That's not the profile of a man who doesn't know what he's doing." She looked out the window. The Atlantic below them was dark gray and textured with whitecaps, the ocean doing what oceans do, which is move constantly and not concern itself with what is happening above it. "He's been managing Whitmore," she said, "controlling what flows through the compromise rather than being controlled by it." "That's my current read," Lucian said, "which makes him either the most sophisticated long-game operator I've encountered in 30 years, or a man who made one catastrophic mistake in judgment and has been compensating for it every day since." "Which do you think?" Lucien was quiet for a moment. "I think," he said slowly, "that the answer is probably both." She turned from the window. "I want to talk to him, in person. Zurich, when we land, I want him on a plane." "I can arrange that." "And I want the notebook," she said. "My father's notebook. I want to read what he wrote." Lucien reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, the jacket he'd been wearing since yesterday, since Chicago, since the jet ride that had started all of this, and produced a small, dark-covered notebook, the kind that costs $4 at any stationery shop and lasts a lifetime if you treat it carefully. He set it on the table between them. She looked at it, did not pick it up yet. "He loved you," Lucien said. It came out differently than she expected. Not as consolation, not as the kind of thing people say when the hard facts have been delivered and they want to soften the landing. It came out like testimony, like a man saying something under oath. "I want you to know that everything he did, the identity, the disappearance, the index, sending me, all of it, every piece of it, came from that first. The strategy came second. You came first. She picked up the notebook. She did not open it yet. She held it in both hands and felt the weight of it, which was not heavy. A small notebook. A man's last weeks, compressed into something you could carry in a pocket. Get some sleep, she said. We have 6 hours. Lucien looked at her for a moment. Then he leaned back in his seat, closed his eyes, and, because he was fundamentally a practical man, and practicality included recognizing when rest was the only useful remaining option, was asleep in under 3 minutes. She opened the notebook. She read it all. Every page, including the pages where his handwriting deteriorated at the edges because he was tired or medicated or both, including the pages that were lists of numbers she'd need the Basel account to decode, including 3 pages near the middle that were not strategy or logistics but something else. A father writing to a daughter he didn't know if he'd ever speak to again, in the private way that people write when they are not writing for an audience but for the act of having said the thing before the chance to say it was gone. He'd written about the kitchen in Geneva, about the morning she left, about how he'd stood at the window and watched her car go down the drive and had thought, with the specific precision of a man who spent his life calculating consequences, that he had made the right call, and that the right call was going to cost him something he could not get back. He'd written, "She has her mother's eyes and my stubbornness, which is either the best possible combination or the most dangerous one. I've never been able to decide. Probably both." She sat with that sentence for a while. Then she closed the notebook, put it in her backpack next to the cream envelope, and looked out at the ocean for a long time without thinking about anything specific, which was the closest thing to rest she was going to get for the next 6 hours. Zurich in November was the color of old pewter, sky the shade of something that had been silver once and oxidized to a dignified gray. They landed at 7 in the evening local time, which meant they'd lost the day somewhere over the ocean, which meant Serena had now been awake for 36 hours, which she noted as a fact about her body without particular interest in acting on it. Carver Holt was at the private terminal when they arrived. He'd flown commercial, Frankfurt to Zurich, the first available flight after Lucien's people reached him. He was standing near the terminal entrance in a dark overcoat with his hands in his pockets, and when Serena came through the door ahead of Lucien and Declan, he looked at her with an expression she recognized because she had seen it before on exactly one other person, her father, the morning she left Geneva, standing at the window. The expression of someone who has been waiting a very long time for a reckoning they chose and still find harder than they anticipated. "You knew him," she said. No preamble. She was too tired for preamble, and the time for careful approaches was in a different part of the story. "Yes," Carver said. "How long?" "Since 2015. He reached out to me through a mutual contact in the Treasury International Division. He had documents he needed evaluated by someone outside his own network. I looked at what he had and understood immediately that it was significant." He paused. "We worked together for the last 5 years of his life, mostly remotely. I met him in person 4 times. "He trusted you," she said. "I believe so." A beat. "I hope so." "Why didn't you tell Lucien?" Carver looked past her briefly at Lucien, who was standing 6 feet back with the neutral expression of a man choosing not to insert himself into a conversation that was not his to control. "Because your father asked me not to. He said—" He stopped, looked back at her. "He said Lucien was the best protection he'd ever seen in his life. And he trusted him completely with your physical safety. And he didn't trust him with the legal case because Lucien's instincts and Lucien's methods would eventually diverge from what the legal case required. And he needed the legal case to be clean." She thought about that. "He was right," she said. "He was usually right," Carver said. "It was one of the more exhausting things about him." Something shifted slightly in the air between them. Not warmth exactly, but the acknowledgement of a shared experience of the same complicated man. "Whitmore," she said. "I know." "How long have you known he's compromised?" Carver's jaw tightened. 18 months. I discovered it through a discrepancy in how operational information was flowing, timing inconsistencies between what I reported and how Solon's network responded. I ran a test, gave Whitmore a piece of false information through normal channels, and watched where it landed. He paused. It landed inside a Solon subsidiary in Malta within 72 hours. And you kept reporting to him, she said. I kept feeding him carefully selected information while building a separate evidentiary track documenting his complicity, Carver said. Every piece of information I gave him after that test was either false, deliberately delayed, or designed to lead his network in the wrong direction. He met her eyes. Your location leak last night. The neighborhood, not the building. I gave him a false neighborhood. Elizabeth, New Jersey. She went very still. Solon's people went to Elizabeth, she said. That's where Lucien was taken. From Elizabeth. Yes, Carver said. Which means Solon's operational team was in Elizabeth because Whitmore sent them there, and they encountered Lucien's people there, which is not what I anticipated. He looked past her again at Lucien, a look with an apology in it that did not use the word apology. I'm sorry for that. I did not anticipate that Lucien would have people in Elizabeth. I had people in Elizabeth, Lucien said from behind her, because I anticipated that you would give Whitmore a location, and I anticipated it would be false, and Elizabeth was the most logical false location given the port access. A pause. I walked my own people into your operation. We have both been running parallel tracks on the same case for 4 years, Carver said, and neither of us told the other the full picture. No, Lucien said. We didn't. The three of them stood in the pewter Zurich evening with that acknowledgement between them, the specific discomfort of intelligent people recognizing that their individual competence had combined to produce a collective mess. Whitmore, Serena said, bringing them back, what's the state of your evidentiary file on him? Sufficient for a referral to the DOJ Inspector General and a parallel Senate ethics complaint, Carver said. Not yet sufficient for criminal prosecution without corroborating material from the Basel Index. What specifically do you need from the index? He reached into his coat and produced a folded sheet, 2 pages, dense with notation. She took it, looked at it. It was a precise list, cross-referenced, identifying exactly which transactions in the Solon network connected to accounts that Whitmore had specifically shielded through committee action over the past 6 years. She handed it back. I can pull those from the archive tonight. You'll have them by morning. Carver took the pages, folded them back into his coat. There's something else you need to know, he said. The shift in his voice, a register lower, a fraction slower, told her before the words did that what came next was not logistics. Daria Castillo, he said. She's agreed to cooperate. Serena looked at him. She contacted the FBI's Financial Crimes Division this morning through a private attorney, Carver said. She's offering full cooperation on the Solon network's domestic money operations in exchange for a negotiated resolution on the charges against her. She's prepared to testify to the specific operational direction she received regarding her assignment to Nolan Pierce and the directive to accelerate the divorce. He paused. She included, in her initial proffer, a statement that she was directed to ensure Serena Ashcroft was socially and financially isolated before Solon's team made contact. She's covering herself, Serena said. Yes. She's also, and this is the part that matters for the case, prepared to name the domestic coordinator who managed her assignment, the person inside the United States who ran the operational layer between Solon's network and the people placed around your husband. Whitmore, she said. His chief of staff, Carver said. Whitmore has insulation. The chief of staff does not. The chess of it was almost beautiful, in the cold, technical way that certain complex things are beautiful when you are exhausted enough to stop being outraged by them and simply see the structure. Pull the thread, she said. That's exactly what we intend, Carver said. Chelm, the Ashcroft family attorney's office was on the Bahnhofstrasse, in a building that had housed the same firm for 60 years. The attorney himself, a man named Werner Falk, 71, who had served Elias Ashcroft with the particular loyalty of someone who had seen too much of the world to be easily impressed, and had been impressed anyway, met Serena at 8:30 in the evening in a conference room on the 3rd floor with 2 associates and a stack of documents she recognized as her father's estate architecture. She signed what needed signing. She authorized what needed authorizing. She made, In the space of 90 minutes, a series of decisions that transformed the Ashcroft Holdings from a semi-dormant estate in probate into an active legal entity under her full control, with the criminal-adjacent operations either dissolved or separated through structures Werner Falk had been quietly preparing for 2 years at Lucien's direction. At 10:15, she authorized the Basel account access to provide Carver's evidentiary list to a secure DOJ server that Carver established on his own laptop in the corner of the conference room. She watched the transfer complete. She watched Carver close his laptop with an expression on his face that she understood. The expression of someone who has been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time and has just set it down in the right place. "How long until the Whitmore referral goes through?" she asked. "If the IG moves at normal speed, 8 weeks. If the FBI Financial Crimes Division can use Castillo's cooperation to accelerate, possibly 4. He looked at her. "He'll know it's coming before it arrives. Men in his position always do." "Will he run?" "He'll try to manage it. Men like Whitmore don't run. They have too much invested in the appearance of legitimacy." Carver's voice carried a familiar weariness. "He'll spend those 8 weeks calling in every favor he has, which is exactly what we want him doing, because calling in favors creates a paper trail of who answers." She nodded. She was tired in a way that had moved past physical and become atmospheric, a tiredness that lived in the air around her rather than specifically in her body. She looked at Lucien across the conference room, where he'd been sitting with Werner Falk for the past hour, going through the operational dissolution documents. He looked up at the same moment, the way people do when they've been in enough difficult rooms together that they develop a peripheral awareness of each other. He'd had the cut above his eyebrow cleaned and closed with 2 small strips of medical tape. It made him look, incongruously, slightly more human than usual. She looked away. Nolan Pierce was in his attorney's guest room in Lincoln Park when Serena reached him on a secured line 3 days later. He'd done exactly what she told him, left the Evanston house within the hour, cash cabbed to his attorney's home in Evanston proper, sat with that attorney for 2 days while the federal compliance situation was assessed and characterized, and the distinction between what he had done and what had been done under his name was established in preliminary documentation. His voice on the line was different from the voice she'd heard at 3 a.m. The fear was still there, but it had changed shape, become less like panic and more like the residual tenderness of a bruise. The voice of a man who had been badly frightened and was now in the long, unglamorous process of understanding why. "The attorney says the shell entities are the key," he said. "If we can prove the signatures were forged or coerced, the money laundering exposure shifts significantly." "Castillo's cooperation will help with that," she said. "She's provided documentation of the operational directive. The forgery question is going to come down to forensic document analysis, but you have a strong preliminary position." A pause. "You've been talking to federal investigators. I've been providing access to certain financial records that bear on the overall case," she said. "Your situation is a subset of something much larger. The people building the larger case have an interest in accurately characterizing your role." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had the specific quality of someone saying something they have rehearsed in their head and are now discovering is harder to say aloud than in the rehearsal. "Serena," he said, I want to say something, and I understand if you'd prefer I didn't, but I need to say it." "Say it," she said. "I spent 14 years," he said, "telling myself I'd built everything I had through my own work, my own intelligence, my own decisions." He stopped, started again. I never once considered that someone could be working around me, through me, that the decisions I was proud of were being shaped by people I'd never met for purposes I didn't understand." Another stop. "That's humbling in a way I don't have adequate language for." "That's not what you want to say," she said. A pause. "No," he said. "What I want to say is that I treated you like you were less than you were. Not because I was evil, because I was stupid in the specific way that ambitious men are stupid. I looked at you and saw what you appeared to be instead of paying attention to what you actually were." His voice was steady, but the steadiness cost something. She could hear the cost. You tried to warn me in the way quiet people warn you, by being completely still in the middle of everything moving. I thought that was weakness. It wasn't. She listened to the silence that followed, the specific silence of two people on opposite sides of a finished thing, standing in it. You're going to be all right, she said. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't the closing of the distance between what he'd been and what she'd needed. It was something simpler and more durable, an honest assessment. I don't know that yet, he said. No, she agreed, but you will be. She ended the call. She sat in the chair in her hotel room in Zurich, a different hotel, one Lucien had chosen for its exits rather than its aesthetics, and held the phone in her lap and was very quiet for a while. Victor Solon was detained by Swiss federal authorities 6 days after Serena landed in Zurich, in connection with a financial crimes investigation request filed jointly by the U.S. DOJ and the Italian Guardia di Finanza. The detainment was not an arrest. It was the kind of formal, lawyered, carefully managed process that happens to men with Victor Solon's resources, which is to say it was the beginning of a long and expensive legal process that would produce, eventually, a result. The nature of that result was not yet written. Congressman Dale Whitmore announced 2 weeks later that he would not seek re-election, citing health reasons. The announcement came 4 days before the Inspector General's referral became public record. His chief of staff resigned the same afternoon through an attorney with no comment. Daria Castillo's cooperation agreement was finalized in the third week of November. Her testimony ran to 47 pages and named 11 individuals in the domestic Solon operational network. She received a negotiated resolution that her attorney characterized, in a statement no one paid much attention to, as reflecting the totality of her cooperation and the unusual circumstances of her case. She moved to another city. She did not appear in Serena's life again. Carver Holt took an extended leave from his position and spent 3 months in Asheville, North Carolina, actually there this time. He called Serena once in January to tell her the evidentiary file had been formally accepted by the DOJ Criminal Division and assigned to a task force. He sounded like a man who had put down the heavy thing in the right place and was now learning how to stand upright without it. She told him to take care of himself. He said he intended to. She believed him. Lucien Vescari declined every invitation, inquiry, and pressure applied to him to take any formal position in the post-Solon reorganization of the criminal financial landscape he had spent 30 years navigating. She heard this from Declan, not from Lucien directly, because in the 6 weeks after Zurich, Lucien communicated with her exactly 3 times. Once to confirm that the operational dissolution of the Ashcroft legacy businesses was complete, once to send her a document she needed for the Werner Falk estate filing, and once, on a Thursday evening in December, with no context, to send a single text from a number she almost didn't answer. Your father would have been proud, not of the outcome, of you. She stared at that text for a long time. She typed back, "Where are you?" The response was the last thing she received from Lucien Vescari for a very long time. "Somewhere that needs a different kind of work. I'll be in touch." She put the phone down. She sat in her apartment in New York, a different one from the Midtown property, smaller, in a building where she was Sarah Cole on the lease and Serena Ashcroft in her own understanding of herself, because she was done choosing between those two things and had decided to be both. And she looked at the winter light coming through the window at a low angle the way it does in December, the specific light of a city doing its work without asking anything of you. She went back to Chicago in January. Not to the Evanston House, not to the courthouse on Michigan Avenue, not to any of the specific locations where the specific events of a specific chapter of her life had occurred. She went to O'Hare, to the private terminal on the south end where the matte black Gulfstream had landed on the morning the divorce became final and changed the direction of everything. The terminal was ordinary in January, a few small aircraft, a family with too much luggage, a man in a suit reading something on his phone with the practiced disconnection of someone who had logged too many hours in departure lounges. She stood near the window and looked at the apron where the jet had been. It was empty today. Just tarmac and gray sky and the distant sound of the commercial runways doing their relentless, ordinary work. She was not there to mourn something. She was not there for the symbolic architecture of return and closure. She was there because she'd had a connecting flight through O'Hare, and she'd had 40 minutes between gates, and she'd made a choice about how to spend those 40 minutes, and the choice had brought her here. She stood at the window and looked at the empty tarmac. She thought about her father writing in a small notebook in the last weeks of his life. She thought about Lucien's face in the jet when he'd said, "I gave you 3 years," and the specific weight that simple sentence carried. She thought about Nolan signing divorce papers with the Mont Blanc pen and the cufflinks she'd given him for their 10th anniversary, and she thought about the version of herself who had sat on her side of that table and signed her name and known, not feared, not suspected, but known, that the quiet life she'd built was not the life she'd actually been living, and that the life she'd actually been living had been waiting for her to stop pretending otherwise. She was 38 years old. She had her father's stubbornness and her mother's eyes, and a clearance sale suitcase she'd left in a hotel room in New York as a deliberate act of leaving behind the version of herself who bought things on sale because someone else managed the money. She had the Ashcroft name and what she'd decided to make of it, which was something her father had wanted and something different from what he'd built. She had Werner Falk on the Bahnhofstrasse and Carver Holt in Asheville and Declan Walsh wherever Declan Walsh went when he wasn't needed, which she suspected was nowhere dramatic. She had a flight to catch. She looked at the empty tarmac one more time, at the place where the stairs had come down and the man with the rearranged face had said, "Welcome home, Miss Ashcroft," and she had picked up her cheap suitcase and walked toward whatever came next. She turned away from the window. She walked back through the terminal toward the main concourse, through the ordinary Tuesday in January traffic of O'Hare, families and business people, and someone's elderly mother being pushed in a wheelchair by a harried adult child, the full, indifferent human inventory of an airport that processed 60,000 people a day and did not track what any of them were carrying when they came through. She moved through it without hurrying, without looking back. Not because she had no past, not because the past didn't weigh what it weighed or cost what it had cost, but because she was Serena Ashcroft, daughter of a complicated man who had loved her first and strategized second, and she was late for a flight, and there was work to do, and the work was hers, and she was going to do it. The terminal doors opened ahead of her. She walked through.